I always believed that family meant protection, that no matter how cruel the world became, blood would never turn against me. But I was wrong. It wasn't strangers who broke me that day. It was the people who once swore they loved me. On the morning of my brother's wedding, I walked in wearing a smile that didn't belong to me. Everyone saw the confident businesswoman, the successful sister who had everything. But behind that smile was a storm no one could see. They thought they could humiliate me quietly, tuck me away in a corner, remind me where they thought I belonged. They didn't know the contracts they depended on had my name on them. They didn't know the woman they tried to silence held the power to destroy everything they'd built. I sat there in that dimly lit corner, listening to the laughter, the music, the lies, and I realized something. Revenge doesn't always start with anger. Sometimes it begins with silence. By the time the night ended, they had no idea what was coming. But I did. Because when your own family treats you like an outsider, how far would you go to make them regret it? Before everything fell apart, my life looked perfect. At least, that's what everyone thought. I had built a name for myself in an industry where women like me were rarely taken seriously. My company handled event partnerships, contracts worth millions, the kind of deals that could make or break reputations overnight. I worked for years, alone most of the time, driven by a mix of pride and something deeper, a quiet need to prove that I was more than what my family believed I could be. Growing up, I was always the one they underestimated. My brother, Daniel, was the golden child, charming, ambitious, the one everyone praised at every family dinner. I loved him, truly, but it was hard to ignore how easily he got what I had to fight for. Our parents adored him. The relatives, too. And me? I was the one who worked too much, the one they said would eventually settle down. Still, I tried to believe we were a family, imperfect but bound by love. Even when they laughed off my success, even when they compared every move I made to Daniel's effortless charm, I stayed silent. Because that's what you do for your family, right? When Daniel got engaged, the whole house came alive. My mother couldn't stop gushing about his fiancée, a woman who, from the first moment I met her, looked at me like I was competition. I noticed it in the way she smiled too sweetly, the way she spoke about my career, as if it were just a hobby. But I ignored it. I wanted peace. I remember helping with the wedding arrangements, quietly proud that my company was handling part of the partnership deals for the venue, one of our biggest clients. It wasn't about showing off. It was about being part of something that mattered to my family. I thought maybe, just maybe, this wedding would bring us closer. But there were signs I chose not to see. The small comments about how some people forget where they came from. The sudden distance between my brother and me. The way my calls started going unanswered once the wedding planning began. I told myself it was just stress, wedding pressure, family dynamics, nothing personal. But deep down, something in me felt the shift. That familiar ache, the one I'd felt as a little girl standing outside closed doors, hearing laughter that didn't include me, came back. Still, I pushed it aside. I smiled through every family gathering, offered help wherever I could, even when I felt invisible. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't crash into your life all at once. It creeps in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments. The week of the wedding, I was drowning in work, trying to make sure everything ran smoothly for both my client and my family. I stayed up late finalizing the venue's partnership documents, the same contract that would soon become my silent weapon. But at that time, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about belonging, about showing up for people who rarely showed up for me. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up before dawn. The city was still asleep, the air heavy with that strange mix of excitement and exhaustion. I remember standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my dress, telling myself, this is going to be a good day. But somewhere inside, a part of me didn't believe it. Because no matter how much success I had, no matter how strong I appeared, I was still that girl, the one waiting to be accepted. I didn't know it yet, but that day would change everything. By the time the lights dimmed and the music began, I would no longer be the woman trying to fit in. I would be the woman they never should have underestimated. They guided me out of the ballroom like I was an afterthought, not a sister. The staff told me it was better to keep me in the kitchen, where the caterers could, in their words, look after me. The words landed like a slap. My dress brushed past plates and silverware as I sat on a folding chair beneath a fluorescent bulb that buzzed louder than the music upstairs. Through the pass-through window, I could see the reception. Glittering lights, the chorus of congratulations, the faces that belonged to me growing smaller as they laughed in clusters. I wasn't invited to join. Humiliation at a wedding is a special kind of pain because the world is watching and pretending not to notice. My cheeks burned, but more than shame there was a sting of disbelief. This wasn't an accident. It felt deliberate, an orchestrated reminder of a place I'd been assigned in their story of us. I watched servers pass trays. I watched my mother smile at my brother with a tenderness that felt like a verdict. I watched Daniel kiss his bride, and I felt the chill that comes when someone claims what you thought was yours. Sitting there, hidden between chafing dishes and a stack of linen, I replayed the morning in a new light. I remembered the private texts that had gone unanswered, the quiet sidebar conversations that had stopped when I entered a room, the compliments that landed with thinly veiled pity, the subtle way they'd pointed out that running a business was hard for a woman with a family. For a second, anger flared and then contracted into something colder. Rage was too loud. This was a mute, focused thing. It sat under my ribs like a coiled instrument waiting to be plucked. It took less time than I expected to see the patterns. The wedding had not happened in a vacuum. Deals had been rerouted, contacts replaced, meetings postponed with suspicious regularity. My company had been the backbone of the venue's partnerships for years. I had built relationships, negotiated clauses, stayed up nights poring over fine print that no one else read. The documents I drafted bore my fingerprints in ink and habit. I knew the levers. I knew whose names were on the dotted lines and whose signatures carried weight. I could map their dependencies like constellations. When I slipped back into the reception, quietly, as if I hadn't been banished, what hit me first was the choreography of glances. Conversations tightened like a curtain drawing closed, and laughter came in measured, rehearsed bursts. There was a moment, a flicker, when my brother's eyes met mine and then slid away. His face held something I could no longer call brotherly. It held the careful distance of a man calculating consequences. The woman at his side, whose smile had once seemed merely sharp, watched me as if measuring a commodity. I realized then that I had not been accidentally seated in the kitchen. I had been made invisible on purpose. After the reception, the house seemed smaller. The living room hummed with congratulatory noise while I moved through it like a ghost. People congratulated me with the same hollow praise they gave any guest they'd already forgiven. My phone buzzed, and I ignored it at first, habits of avoidance inherited from years of pretending not to care. When I finally checked the messages, there was one email that made my stomach drop. It was a forwarded thread from a junior manager at the venue, the kind of innocuous correspondence I'd normally handle without a second thought. The subject line was bland, but the content was not. There were notes about contingency plans, clauses to be activated if a certain sponsor pulled out, and, most importantly, a list of dependencies tied to my firm's contract. The trail was breadcrumb thin, but it was there. Somebody had quietly pivoted away from my company, rerouted key sponsorships, and put someone else in charge. Whoever did it had used people I trusted as instruments. Reading that thread felt like peeling wallpaper off a wall to reveal a mold of betrayal beneath. The more I looked, the more the edges of the pattern sharpened. Conversations that excluded me, meetings that were suddenly scheduled without my knowledge, a whispering campaign about my priorities and balance. It was not just professional sabotage. It was personal. I thought about confronting them, about standing in the living room and naming names, but experience taught me that raw confrontations rarely accomplish anything but noise. I wanted it quieter. I wanted everything to fall apart in a way that left no room for denials. I wanted to use the thing they relied on and trusted against them, the contracts, the deals, the polished network that made their lives seamless. Over the next few days, I watched. I listened to casual remarks at lunches I pretended to enjoy. I scanned receipts, pulled up old emails, and dove into archives I'd helped create. I reconstructed meetings from fragments and logged the shifts. Each small discovery fed a growing architecture of proof. People had assumed I was fragile because I cared about family appearances. They had assumed I'd lick my wounds in private and move on. They were wrong. There's a peculiar clarity that settles over you when you stop being surprised. Things fall into their rightful shape. Humiliation loses its power when you recognize it as a strategy. My anger matured into a plan, slow, meticulous, and impossibly patient. I would not be theatrical. I would be surgical. The contracts they depended on were not mere paper. They were mechanisms, with triggers and penalties and leverage points that could be engaged remotely. I knew which clauses could be activated to suspend sponsorships, which force majeure language could be interpreted if a vendor changed control, which exclusivity terms could be enforced to make a partner's life suddenly impossible. I started mapping consequences like an engineer designing a dam. I drew lists. I prioritized targets not by who had hurt me the most, but by who would hurt the most if their public image cracked. Reputation was currency in their world, and I intended to make their credit collapse. The more I planned, the less like revenge it felt, and the more like something inevitable, an audit of justice that had been delayed for years. At night, when the house quieted and the city lights blurred beyond my window, I thought about the cost. Revenge, I knew, was not a clean ledger. It left stains. But in that ledger, there were entries worth paying for. The quiet satisfaction of watching arrogance meet consequence, the small consolation of hearing someone who'd sneered at you try to explain themselves and find no words that mattered. I imagined them scrambling to salvage what I could make vanish, their polished statements turning brittle under scrutiny. I imagined the precise moment when they would finally notice they had been crossed by someone they thought they controlled. There were practicalities, too. Allies I had to approach discreetly. Paperwork that needed rerouting. Timing that had to be perfect. Too early, and I'd be dismissed as petty. Too late, and the window of impact would close. I thought about my brother's wedding guest list, and mapped who would feel the shock the most. I thought about my mother's face when she realized she'd sided with image over truth. I thought about Daniel and the way he always assumed his choices would never cost him anything. Each night I added small, calculated moves to my plan. Each morning I checked that nothing had changed that would betray my intentions. I practiced the art of being ordinary, laughing at the right moments, asking about the caterer, offering to arrange a last-minute rehearsal, so no one suspected I was anything but the dutiful sister. They had reduced me to an understudy in my own life, and I played the role because it was the perfect disguise. But even the most carefully drawn plan needs a trigger. That moment, an email clicked, a call made, a signature withheld, would be the pivot. I knew what the trigger could be. I had it within my reach, folded into the same legal language I had written, and revised until it was watertight. It was elegant and malicious in equal measure, not a shout but a removal so precise that it would send ripples through their network without leaving fingerprints on the obvious surfaces. On the night I finally decided to move from analysis to action, the house held its breath. I sat at my desk with the contract open on my laptop and the memory of the kitchen, of the hum of the fluorescent light and the sting of being watched, rising up like a cold tide. My hands hovered over the keys, steady now, the old tremor replaced by purpose. I imagined the faces I'd seen laughing at my expense, the easy assumption that I would accept my place. A message arrived then, innocuous and late, the kind of thing that would have been ignored on any other night. It was neither boast nor apology. It contained a single line that threaded through everything I had uncovered, a confirmation of a meeting, a hint at a shortcut, a name I had not expected to see. For a moment I considered backing away, letting the silence be my revenge. But silence had already done its work. It was time for sound. I closed the file, exhaled, and for the first time since the wedding, felt the full weight of what I was about to do. The plan was no longer theoretical. The pieces were in place. The next steps would be irreversible. When I pressed send on the first directive, I didn't feel triumph. I felt the inevitable click of a lock turning. And then the world began to tilt. The night I chose to act felt impossibly ordinary at first, a soft rain tapping my window, the city lights smeared like watercolor beyond glass. I had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in my head, mapped every contingency, and still the second my finger hovered over the final command, the world condensed to a single breath. Everything I had built, every slight and every quiet bruise, funneled into this one deliberate decision. I started with the contracts. Not a theatrical reveal, not an angry confession in front of a room full of relatives, but a surgical series of withdrawals and notifications that would make their world unravel without immediate explanation. I executed the clauses I had written years earlier with the kind of precision that comes from knowing the architecture of someone's life. Sponsorships were suspended, exclusivity clauses triggered, contingency payments frozen. I sent emails that looked routine and watched as automatic systems, the invisible scaffolding they relied on, began to wobble. At first, nothing dramatic happened. That was the cruelest part. The silence. Their world doesn't collapse in the loud way movies show. It collapses in tiny failures, a transfer that doesn't go through, a vendor who suddenly has to back out, a payment flagged for review. But then the ripples accelerated. A partner pinged the venue with questions that had no easy answers. The venue called the events team called the sponsors called their legal counsel. The choreography I knew so well turned into chaos. My phone lit up with alerts, confirmations, denials, requests for clarification. I watched spreadsheets that had once been steady as bedrock betray their owners, rows of green turning red as dependencies broke. The people who had treated me like an afterthought were suddenly scrambling to preserve an image they'd always taken for granted. Panic sounds I had only heard from the outside now leaked into my inbox, the thin, polite language of corporate crisis descending into blunt requests and frantic apologies. I remember the moment the first call came through from someone in their inner circle, not to me, but to a mutual partner. The tone on the other end was not anger so much as disbelief. A carefully curated public face was cracking, and everyone was desperately searching for a way to glue it back together. My brother's name started appearing in terse emails I had saved for years, sent in a voice that suddenly found him unprepared. I watched him in my mind, the confident boy from childhood reduced, in a matter of hours, to a man who could no longer assume immunity. The crescendo of the plan was not the legal maneuvers alone, it was the timing. I had arranged for an industry gala to coincide with the fallout, an event where their reputations would be most visible, where sponsor seats and brand logos could not be hidden. I watched as the gala program shuffled, as slides for sponsors went blank in the center of a presentation, as MCs smoothed over the awkward silence with rehearsed lines that landed like paper on wood. Cameras caught furrowed brows and forced smiles. Social feeds, which had been primed for celebration, turned into instruments of exposure. Clips circulated with commentary that threaded disbelief with schadenfreude. My heart performed a strange duet throughout it all, a steady, businesslike rhythm that had planned every clause, and a quick, wild beating that remembered the girl sitting under fluorescent light. Triumph elicited no giddy laughter. It was cool, almost clinical. But even in that coolness, a current ran through me, a recognition that I had crossed a line I could not uncross. I felt the weight of the consequences settle onto my shoulders like a heavy coat. There was relief, certainly, but also an ache that surprised me. Revenge is never purely sweet. It tastes like ash and metal sometimes, and that mixture is strangely intoxicating. The first public crack widened when a trusted outlet, tipped anonymously with carefully compiled documents and timelines I had assembled, published a piece that reframed the story. It didn't scream accusations. It laid out facts in a quiet, methodical way that made denials look theatrical. Readers could see the rerouting of deals, the last-minute changes, the moments where my name had been erased from threads and replaced with other signatures. The narrative shifted in real time from a family celebration to an example of corporate collusion and personal betrayal. Comments exploded, shares multiplied, and the network effect did what I had suspected it would. It turned private humiliation into public scrutiny. What came next was a new kind of power play. PR statements were cobbled together. Legal representatives issued carefully worded reassurances. My brother did what he always did when faced with pressure. He smiled in public and retreated behind statements. But smiles don't pay for lost deals, and statements don't undo the dominoes that had already fallen. Partners began to distance themselves, citing reputational risk. Contracts I had once negotiated with pride were suddenly weapons I had chosen to use. Some people would view me as cruel. Others would call my actions justified. Neither label mattered in that moment. What mattered was that the people who had belittled me were forced to defend themselves in rooms that once protected them. There was a point when I realized the revenge had ignited something larger than my personal vendetta. Articles dissected how power had been wielded in private, how female ambition was too often recast as threat. Strangers sent messages that read like confessions and encouragement, stories that mirrored mine in ways that made my chest ache with shared hurt. It was not the outcome I had sought at the start. I had wanted a personal reckoning, but as the fallout grew, it became clear that consequences were spilling into places I had not anticipated. That realization complicated the victory I had constructed. As the night ran its course, I sat alone in my apartment, the glow of my laptop screen painting my hands in blue light. The alert slowed, the immediate chaos settling into the steady work of damage control. I scrolled through headlines that bore my fingerprints in ways I couldn't unsee. For a fleeting moment, I let myself imagine the faces of those who had laughed when I was tucked away in the kitchen. Would they feel the same hollow loss that had hollowed me out? Would they know, finally, what it means to be rendered invisible? Then a message arrived that made the blood drain from my face. It was not a vindictive taunt nor a grateful message of support. It was a single image from someone I had tried to protect in my planning, a photograph taken at the gala. My mother, hands clasped, eyes wide and hollow, an expression that spoke of disbelief and a dawning, terrible clarity. For the first time since the plan started, I felt a tremor of something I had not allowed myself to feel fully before, a sharp, unfamiliar guilt. Revenge had landed where it hurt most, and part of me had known it would. I closed the laptop slowly, the room suddenly too quiet. I had won in the way I intended. They could no longer pretend the truth was different. But the victory was not the triumphant banner I'd imagined. It was a complicated knot of relief, sorrow, and the uneasy knowledge that some relationships might never recover. The world had tilted. The consequences would play out in months, in reputations, in conversations I would no longer be part of. I held that ambiguity and let it sit like a stone in my palm. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, I felt the echo of my actions reverberate through the house I had once wanted to belong to. I had pulled the table from beneath them. Now I had to stand and watch where everyone landed. The real test was not the collapse itself, but what came after, for them and for me. When the dust finally settled, I stood there, breathing, shaking, alive. The chaos had ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm. I had done it. Every piece of my revenge had fallen perfectly into place, every lie exposed, every mask torn off. For months, I'd replayed that moment in my head, wondering what it would feel like to finally win. But standing there, watching the people who'd wronged me crumble beneath the truth, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a release. The night I executed my plan, something in me shifted. I wasn't the same woman who had cried herself to sleep or second-guessed her worth. I had faced them all, without trembling, without backing down. The power they once had over me was gone. I watched their world unravel in real time, not with rage anymore, but with a quiet understanding. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about reclaiming myself. In the days that followed, whispers turned to headlines, and headlines turned to silence. People talked, speculated, and judged. But none of it mattered. The truth had finally spoken for itself. My brother tried to reach out, but what could he say? There are apologies that come too late to mean anything. There are wounds that don't need closure, just distance. I thought revenge would heal me completely, that exposing them would erase the pain. But healing isn't that simple. The betrayal had carved deep into me, and even justice couldn't fill that space. What it did give me, though, was clarity. I realized that sometimes we chase revenge not because we want to destroy others, but because we're desperate to feel in control again. And maybe, for the first time, I did feel in control. I rebuilt my business, my reputation, my peace. Slowly, the noise faded. The anger that once drove me started to quiet down. I found new routines, new people who saw me for who I really was, not the woman they tried to break, but the one who refused to stay broken. There were moments I caught myself wondering if I'd gone too far. If maybe I'd become the very thing I despised, cold, calculating, ruthless. But every time I remembered their laughter, their lies, the way they dismissed me like I was invisible, I knew one truth. I didn't start this war. I just finished it. And yet, revenge has a strange aftertaste. It's sweet in the beginning, intoxicating even. But when it's over, what remains isn't satisfaction, it's emptiness. Because revenge doesn't give back what was taken. It doesn't erase betrayal or pain. It just evens the score. Still, I don't regret it. I needed to see that moment, to feel it, to know I wasn't powerless. Maybe I could have walked away, taken the high road, but walking away doesn't always mean healing. Sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to reclaim your story. Now, when people ask me what I learned from all of it, I tell them this: revenge isn't about destruction. It's about transformation. It burns away illusions, the illusion of loyalty, of love without conditions, of fairness in a world that often lacks it. It forces you to look at yourself in the mirror and ask, who am I when I'm pushed too far? I saw myself clearly for the first time, not the woman defined by others' betrayal, but the one who decided her story wouldn't end in pain. Months later, I attended another wedding, this time as a guest, not an outsider shoved into a corner. As the music played and laughter filled the room, I felt something unexpected: peace. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd survived. Because I'd turned my scars into strength. And maybe that's what revenge truly gives you. Not happiness, but power. Not closure, but control. It reminds you that you are not helpless in the face of cruelty. That even when they underestimate you, you can rewrite the ending. But I'll be honest, there are nights I still think about that moment, about the look on their faces when they realized the tables had turned. And sometimes I smile. Not because I'm proud of what I did, but because I know I'll never let anyone silence me again. If you've ever been betrayed, humiliated, or dismissed, maybe you understand. That fire inside you isn't just anger, it's survival. It's the part of you that refuses to be forgotten or walked over. But here's what I've learned: use that fire wisely. Let it light your way forward, not burn your future down. Because in the end, revenge gave me what forgiveness never could: freedom. And yet, as I move forward, one question still lingers, haunting and honest. When we finally get the justice we craved, do we truly move on? Or do we just learn to live with the ashes? So I'll leave you with this. Think about the person who hurt you, the one who made you feel small. Then ask yourself, not how do I get even, but how do I rise? Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't in what you destroy, it's in who you become after the fire.